Tasmanian author and historian Nick Haygarth back in the studio this Sunday morning. Nick, nice to see you again.
Yeah, great to see you, Chris.
Always welcome. You've always got great stories to tell, but I'm not sure what we're talking about this morning, but I've got total confidence.
Oh, good. I thought I might talk about George Wainwright and Ernest Ward, the last two Woolnorth Tigermen. That might actually end up being two stories, though, because there's quite a bit to say. So let me start out by saying, what's a Woolnorth Tigermen? What the hell am I talking about? Well, the VDL company, the Van Diemen's Company, still operates in Tasmania. It has the Woolnorth property in the far northwest at Cape Grim. It's sometimes called the largest dairy operation in Australia. But that company arrived in Tasmania in 1826 as a wool grower with the intention of growing fine wool for the European market. Woolnorth was their major property, but they had other properties south of Burnie, Middlesex Plains as well. And they had the area circular head around Stanley. But through the 19th century, the company believed it had a big problem with the thylacine, particularly at Woolnorth. The thylacine was attacking its sheep, or so they believed. In the period 1871 to 1905, there was a shepherd who operated on the Mount Cameron Run at Woolnorth. Now, Mount Cameron, better known as Mount Cameron West these days, and today it's actually been returned to the Aboriginal community. It's known as Premangana. So they had a stockman at Mount Cameron Run part of whose duties was to maintain a line of snares across a narrow neck of land at Green Point near modern-day Marrawar, because that's the place where they believed the thylacines were entering from the plains, funneling through that narrow neck and coming out onto the Woolnorth property. So they used snares there, necker snares, to try and stop those thylacines entering Woolnorth. So that was one of the duties. But of course, his main duty was tending sheep. He had to maintain fences and do everything. It's general dog's body in effect. In 1889, the Van Diemen's Company advertised for a person to occupy this role, and they didn't use the term Tigerman, even though that was the title used within the VDL company itself. The term Tigerman was coined by James Wilson, who was the manager at Woolnorth in the years 1874 to 98. They called him a Tigerman. They advertised for someone to snare tigers, devils and other vermin at Woolnorth. Now, other vermin meant anything that was likely to attack a sheep, anything that was eating the grass. So that included wallabies and paddy melons. That was the job. £30 a year was the wage. And besides that, there were rations, which would have been bread, potatoes, tea, sugar, no Milo, unfortunately, but salt. And they would have been given a cow to milk, so you get milk. It would have been given a butter churn. So, advertised for this position, there were a huge number of applications. And those written applications survive, and they're amazing. And there are applications from Derby, Branxholme, Ulverston, Latrobe, Waratah, down through the Midlands. There were rabbit trappers down in the Midlands who were applying for it. There was a John Riley, who was a stockman at Connerville, but he was in one of the outer reaches of Connerville, up on the Great Western Tiers, and they were boasting about how many tigers they'd killed. And there was even a letter from Rachel Nichols. Now, Rachel Nichols lived at Windfalls, 18 kilometres west of Campbelltown. That's where the mountain cattlemen have just had their annual muster, get-together. She was writing on behalf of her husband, John Nichols, who was a shepherd at Windfalls. And they together had produced a son, Bert Nichols, who would later be a very well-known hunter,
yes.
The first ranger at Lake St Clair, cutter of the overland track, and also, this was a big family, Wills Nichols, better known as Bill Nichols, who was, of course, a very well-known fisherman in Bass Strait. Quite an extraordinary family. So all these people applied, but none of them got the job. The person who got the job was a person called George Wilson. Who was this George Wilson? Well, he was born as George Wainwright in Launceston in 1864. When you look at what we can work out about his early life, it's a fairly typical existence of a child of an ex-convict father. There are signs of marriage breakup and poverty and hunger and rough living. At the age of 13, he's in court along with another boy charged with stealing apples, and he was acquitted. There was lack of evidence, but you've got to wonder, is that done out of hunger? George Wainwright, as an adult, measured only 162 centimetres. He was 5'3" in the old scale, and there was a scar under his chin. Makes you wonder what life was like on the streets of Launceston. At the age of 20, he was prosecuted under the Master and Servant Act because he'd run off to Sydney. He'd left his employment and run off to Sydney and got a job as a baker. And then in the same year, there was an advertisement posted in a newspaper by his mother warning clergymen not to marry his son to any woman because he was underage. That's what you want. Mother looking out for you. So what that was about was that he'd met a lady called Matilda Maria Carey, not Mariah Carey, but Matilda Maria Carey. And she was pregnant, and they obviously wanted to marry. And they did. Well, I'm not sure where they married, but they certainly united. But George then ran off to Melbourne, changed his name to George Brown, got a job in Melbourne. So he had to be brought back by way of Matilda prosecuting him for maintenance for their baby. And he returned as George Wilson. And I'm not sure what George Wilson is about. Is it because he became a protege of James Wilson, the overseer at Woolnorth? I'm just wondering what that's about. He may have been at Beaconsfield for a couple of years. But anyway, in 1889, he gets the job of Tigerman at Woolnorth. And it's got to be through James Wilson. And he arrives, as one agent of the VDL company wrote later, he arrived under a cloud at Woolnorth. Now, I don't know what that's about, what he was hiding from. But for several years he remained George Wilson while he was at Woolnorth. So the Wainwrights had a big family. They had 6 kids in all.
This is the first wife
George
he's
and
gone
Matilda.
back to. Yeah, they're back together.
They're back together,
Yep.
And eventually they produced 6 children. I don't know how many they had. I can't remember how many they had when they went to Woolnorth originally. They were in a one-room hut originally at Mount Cameron. In 1893, George told a visitor that every thylacine he caught, he got £2 10 shillings. And what that meant was he got £1 from the Van Diemen's Company as a bounty. He got £1 from the government bounty scheme. He got 10 shillings selling the skin. That's what he said. I'm very dubious about this 10 shillings for a thylacine skin because I've seen no evidence that thylacine skins were worth anything. Not at that time. Now, of course, they're 500,000 or something because they're so rare. But if we take him at his word, if we assume that that's what he got for every thylacine he took, he actually killed 55 thylacines in 14 years at Woolnorth. And if we do that calculation of £2 10, he would have received £137 10 shillings over that 14 years. You won't see George Wainwright's name on the government bounty scheme because he would have been selling that thylacine to a Stanley storekeeper who would have been collecting the bounty. So what you do find is there are a lot of storekeepers on the Tasmanian government thylacine bounty scheme. Where he was making his big money, though, was out of selling skins. He had 1893 had 60 snares, and he was getting possums and wallabies and paddy melons. And brush possum was the big ticket item in the Tasmanian fur industry. In 1903, George Wainwright was convicted of receiving stolen skins. He was sent to jail for a year. He only survived 4 months in jail, and he died of heart failure as a result of acute pneumonia. Today, if a 39-year-old man died in custody, there'd be an inquiry into it. Wasn't then, of course. The harshness of his death is in keeping with the harshness of a 12-month sentence for a first offence and with the general drudgery of his life. 2 of his sons, Dick and George Jr., stayed on and had careers with the VDL company, were well known. And the name Wainwright, of course, is still extremely well known in Circular Head. He was the longest lasting of the Woolnorth Tigermen. He had 14 years there, and I think that would be the record, 55 killings. I think I calculated there were about 170 thylacines taken over about a 30-year period. From 1871 onwards, or probably 34-year period. And George Jr. procured some thylacines alive, and George Sr. did as well. So by the 1890s, there are circuses, for example, and zoos, of course, looking for thylacines, and George managed to capture one in 1896 that he brought into Stanley and went up to Worth Circus in Sydney. So there'd started to be this appetite for, because the thylacines were so rare, for living specimens.
Yet there was still a state government bounty on them.
Yeah, until 1909. Yeah, but there were, well, in the last couple of years, there were very few taken.
That's the story of George Wainwright. And Nick, we started this conversation by you saying you want to tell the story of 2 Tigermen of Woolnorth. I think that'll do for this weekend.
Absolutely.
So maybe get you back next week and tell the second one. Nick Haygarth, Tasmanian author and historian, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris.